For decades, we were told that if you put good people in the wrong situation, you can turn ordinary folks into monsters. Or at least that's what Philip Zimbardo, the author of the famous Stanford Prison Experiment, led us to believe. But what if I told you what actually happened looked nothing like the stories Zimbardo shared with the world? In 2019, a French historian painstakingly uncovered hundreds of internal documents and hours of archival audio and video that had sat largely untouched inside Stanford's archives for decades. What those records reveal is a version of events that looks nothing like the one the world was told. Today, we're cracking open what may be one of the most influential and most misleading stories ever told in psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Cracking the shell on the mic, psychological science in sight. Abby bringing that fire sparks when she speaks, ignition on sight. Been with the breakdown, mind state takedown, never miss the details. Mic hitting concepts heavy like freight trains on steel rails. Joey steady mapping brainwaves, decoding how we feel. They turn that abstract real. Yeah, the knowledge is real. They peel it back slow, layer after layer. Mind so deep, yeah, we ride that elevator. Cracking the shell, yeah, we dive into the mind. Abby, Ben, Mike, Joey every time.
Welcome back to Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. I'm Joey Barnet.
And I'm Mike Dougherty. Today, we're cracking open one of the most famous and now most controversial studies in the history of psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment.
If this episode feels relevant right now, that's not an accident. We're living in a moment when questions about power, authority, and institutional behavior keep resurfacing in public life.
And as psychologists, when those moments happen, we often get pulled in to explain why people behave the way they do. Sometimes we know what we're talking about, other times we don't.
That's right. And so today, we're going to try to take a little bit of a closer look into one of these very influential studies in our history.
Okay, so Joey, why don't you describe what the Stanford Prison Experiment was?
Sure. So in 1971, Philip Zimbardo from Stanford launched the Stanford Prison Experiment. Zimbardo is one of the most famous psychologists of the 20th century. He was a social psychologist, and this was largely because of this specific experiment. So the study went like this. A group of college students, they were recruited, and then they were randomly assigned to play the roles of guards or prisoners, right? They were placed in a mock prison that was set up in a university basement, and over the course of a few days, the guards were given the authority, and the prisoners were put under these strict rules. The study is usually described as showing that the situation, not the people, drove dramatic changes in behavior. That was like the main implication, right? Of the study. Right. And so, if you've taken Introduction to Psychology, you probably learned that if you put people in a bad situation and you give them social roles, the situation will turn them cruel.
Joey, I first learned about the Stanford Prison Experiment probably when I was in high school, but let's just say for sure when I was an undergraduate at a community college in Kansas. And, it's one of those experiments that you think, oh my God, this is really cool. And wow, what did we learn about humanity? But this analysis by Thibault Le Texier, this French historian, kind of challenges that narrative, right? So he did a deep archival investigation of what actually happened in this experiment. Not just what I've believed for the last 50 years, but what actually happened. And he did that by digging into the Stanford Library that archived all this, and also the APA Archival Library in Akron, Ohio.
Wow.
And do you want to know what he found?
Yeah, what did he find?
Just the short story is that basically it uncovered a comedy of errors, if you will.
Oh.
Bad methods, biased reporting, and storytelling incentives, right? This idea that, we're going to tell the story that is going to get us the most press and the most attention. And it's the type of thing that can really distort an entire field. In this case, 50 years of distortion.
And it did, right? So, Mike, we've already been talking about this, but why should we care about a study from 1971? I mean, that seems like a long time ago, right? Why should we care?
Right. In some ways, it's like this is a historical artifact in psychology, and maybe we just should be treated as a historical artifact. But the problem is it's been cited in textbooks, documentaries, courtrooms, ethics debates, and even discussions of war crimes. And we use it to support claims about human nature. Claims like anyone can become evil under the right conditions, or situations overwhelm individual agency. And if those claims are based on bad science, that's a serious problem for the way we understand human behavior, but also how we, think about policy.
Right. And so Le Texier's contribution is that he didn't just criticize the experiment from a philosophical point of view. He did. Right. But as you said, he really dug deep into the archives, right? We're talking about hundreds of documents, audio tapes, videos, internal memos, interviews with participants. And what he did was he compared what was published to what was actually documented. All right. So let's talk about kind of the big problems, right? The scientific problems with this experiment. Was the Stanford Prison Experiment actually an experiment?
Well, this is one of the biggest issues because by modern standards, probably we would say no.
Okay.
And arguably not even by 1971 standards.
Okay, so why not?
Well, first of all, there was no clear hypothesis testing. The conclusion that prisons are toxic and dehumanizing, that was basically baked in from the start. Le Texier shows that Zimbardo openly described the study as a demonstration, not a test, not an empirical test.
Yeah, and that really matters, right? Because science is supposed to, let reality surprise us, right? And here, the outcome was anticipated from the start, right? It was encouraged, and then it was later framed as inevitable. So instead of asking the question, what will happen, which is an important question that we ask as scientists, it was, let's show what we already believe.
Right. So this is kind of like a manifestation of confirmation bias.
Yes,
right?
exactly. I was about to say that. Yeah.
We go into the experiment thinking we know what's going to happen, and then we start looking for that finding. So here's one of the big things, right? So let's talk about some of these issues. One of the most damning findings of Le Texier's analysis was that he found that there were intense demand characteristics throughout the entire experiment, which, ironically, Zimbardo himself ultimately helped popularize in psychology.
Right, exactly. And so the guards, they were told explicitly what kind of behavior the experiment was supposed to produce.
Right. Yeah.
Not subtly. It was explicit.
It was explicit.
Yeah, they were trained. I mean, they were even given a script, right?
Somewhat call them coached.
Coached, right. Scripted, they were told to create, it's like a movie, right? They were told to create boredom, fear, powerlessness, and humiliation.
Right, and if the coach tells you to do those things, you're going to do those things.
You do it.
Right.
Of course, you do it. So that alone kind of invalidates the central claim that all of this kind of emerged spontaneously, right? That the cruelty that was exhibited was just kind of, spontaneous, right?
Right.
And so here's the big kicker, though, that the guards were not told they were experimental subjects. They actually believed that they were collaborators that were helping to run the study. So the more they acted tough, the more they thought they were helping science. And so, we can say that's not role absorption, right? I mean, that's compliance.
That kind of makes them kind of like mini experimenters because they were participating in the execution of the experiment under the instructions of the main PI, in this case, Zimbardo. But there's another major scientific issue here, and that is data collection, or maybe we should say the lack of it. Less than 10% of the experiment was recorded, and this particular study depended very heavily on the recording and transcripts of the behaviors. And what was recorded, or at least what was retained, was disproportionately focused on those dramatic moments, right? When there was cruelty or, bad behavior by the guards. So this creates a major sampling bias, like mundane, cooperative, or neutral behavior just wasn't presented or preserved in the data.
Right. So those dramatic clips, they became the basis for these big claims about human nature.
Right.
These, sweeping claims, So Le Texier shows that, most of the guards, they were not necessarily sadistic, right? Some did resist, some were uncomfortable, but those facts don't make it into the textbooks. They rarely do. So the data set just doesn't justify the narrative.
And going back to this issue of demand characteristics, some of those participants kind of described their own behavior as acting, like they were there to play a part.
Right. Some of the guards, they said they were just playing a role because they felt the study needed it. The prisoners often described confusion, not necessarily immersion, about what they were supposed to do.
That ambiguity is crucial. It undermines the idea that people helplessly slipped into brutality.
Let's talk a little bit about ethics, right? But in the context of methodology as well, grounded in methodology. So let's be very clear about what Le Texier is arguing. He's arguing that this isn't just a flawed study, but it's actually a case of epistemic malpractice. So what we mean by that is, how do we know what we know? Right? How do we know what we know? The Stanford Prison Experiment did not simply produce messy data or ambiguous results. It actually produced fiction, right? It produced a fictional scientific plot. And that plot was then presented to the world, to the field of psychology, as empirical discovery.
And Joey, when we talk about academic integrity or research integrity or lack thereof, we think about fraud, like data fraud, like making up data. The data were not fabricated in this case in sort of the traditional sense. So that's not really what we're talking about here. Really what we're talking about is misconduct that lies in how the narrative was wrapped around this study, when the archival data clearly show something completely different, right? That those outcomes, the things that were sort of taken as ground truth from the study, those were engineered and coached and selectively documented and retrospectively framed.
Right. And so that's not inference. That's storytelling under the banner of science.
And the consequences matter, by the way, Joey, in this case, right? This narrative shaped how society thinks about prisons.
Right.
You know, that it shaped how we think about authority and human behavior. It's been used to justify fatalism about abuse,
Right.
to downplay individual agency. Like, well, I don't have any control over the situation. I can only control myself, right? And so when this enters into the policy debate, it becomes really, really problematic.
Influencing legal arguments, right? Correctional policy discussions and public reactions to real-world abuses, right? From prison conditions to military misconduct.
Right. And that's why this isn't just an academic issue, right? So we, I hate to use that phrase, it's just an academic issue, right? But it's not just an academic dispute. When a fictional scientific story enters textbooks and it influences public policy, it doesn't just miseducate, it reshapes how society explains and responds to harm and how we handle harm moving forward.
So kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, right? The ethical failure here isn't primarily about how the participants were treated. That's usually how we think about ethics, right?
And
in most studies.
Exactly.
Right?
And there were some critical, pieces that came out of this. The irony, of course, is that maybe the participants in this case weren't treated as badly as we were led to believe.
Right. But really, they misrepresented reality, right? They misrepresented, the ethical failures were that they misrepresented realities in ways that changed how we govern, right? How we judge and how we excuse human behavior.
Joey, if the study is this flawed, how did it survive for 50 years?
It's a long time. Well, Le Texier gives a few reasons. First, he would say it's a compelling story.
It is.
It is, right? I mean, if, good people become bad people, right?
Yeah.
Good people become monsters. I mean, that's kind of a plot in a lot of movies, right?
How did this fit in with like the zeitgeist at the time? Because I know in social psychology there were some main theory debates.
There were, in the 20th century, there were some really heated debates between personality psychologists and social psychologists, right? Basically arguing over what explained behavior more. Was it the power of the situation or was it the power of our dispositions, our personalities? So this was really popular at the time. And also, this idea of a fundamental attribution error, which fundamental attribution error is this tendency to attribute moral failings to the person, right? And to underestimate the power of the social situation. And so, if we think about Zimbardo's description of this experiment, it basically fits that narrative, right? And then lastly, I will say, this study really became very famous. You can't take a psychology course without learning about this. So when we remove it, right, if we, criticize or remove it, it feels risky, right, for the field.
And, no one bothered to check the archives here until recently on this one.
That's true. No one checked the archives. I guess that's a good lesson, right? Check the archives.
Thank you, Thibault Le Texier, for doing this.
Yes, it's a really important work what he did. So, Mike, we've talked about this a lot. What should be the takeaway here?
Storytelling is not evidence. We're told to write journal articles as if we're telling a story. Well, there's a line. When that storytelling switches over into fiction, that's a serious problem.
Well, Mike, do you have anything else to add to all this? We've talked about a lot. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's about it, Joey.
We've talked about it a lot. Okay, well, I guess that's it then. This has been Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. Until next time, I'm Joey.
And I'm Mike.
But the story ain't exactly how it's told. Listen, they said ordinary students turn cool in a flash. Put a badge on a guard and humanity will crash. Zimbardo with the cameras rolls written in the frame. History books echoing the same old claim. Power makes monsters, look what the system can do. But the archives whisper different when you dig for the truth. Guards got briefed before the doors even closed. How to break the prisoners down, how the pressure should grow. Create boredom, fear, make their freedom feel small. Numbers, not names, watch the individuality fall. Not a wild social force just appearing from the air, more like actors in the script that the researchers prepared. Was it science or a stage in the
Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science is a joint production from Abby Nicholas, Ben Jones, Joey Barnett, and me, Mike Dougherty. We also want to credit ChatGPT and Suno AI for their help behind the scenes today. If you enjoyed what you heard, please help us grow by subscribing and sharing. And hey, if you've got thoughts on the Stanford Prison Study, feel free to drop us an email at crackingtheshellonpsychology@gmail.com. Until next time, remember, a compelling story is nice, but what really matters is telling the truthful story.
Students reading cues like lines in the play, trying to make the important research work the right right way. Guards thought they were helpless, part of the research crew, not subjects in the test that was watching them too. Schedules pre-written, punishment suggested, counts in the night just to keep them stressed and humiliate, frustrate, control every move. Build the prison atmosphere the scientists approve, but textbooks later told a cleaner tale about evil situations and morality that failed. Dig through the tapes, interviews decades later, 15 voices questioning the famous behavior, bias in the data, conclusions pre-planned, reality complicated by the experiment's hand. Some guards stayed calm, didn't play the villain role. Not every mind bent under situational control, but the myth grew louder through lectures and slides, through movies and headlines. Simplified, a cautionary legend about power and fate, but the evidence suggests a different debate. Science needs doubt, not stories that stick. When fame outruns method and the data gets picked. Was it science or a stage in a basement scene? Was it truth or a narrative sold to the screen? When the roles get coached and the outcomes known, is it human nature or a study overthrown? Oh, question the legend, look under the scheme. The Stanford prison story ain't as simple as it seems. Yeah. So remember when the headline claims the darkness of man. Check the method, check the script, check the plan, because history in the textbook can drift from the fact, and sometimes the real experiment is pulling truth back.